29th of January, 1943. Hatfield, Hertfordshire. Gone midnight, and the blackout darkness over the de Havilland Aircraft Works is doing exactly what it was designed to do, hiding everything. Tonight, though, that darkness is being put to a rather unusual use. Men move across the factory grounds, carrying not rifles or fire hoses, but pots of paint, sheets of corrugated iron, and something that looks absurdly like an oversized papier-mâché model. They are building a bomb crater, not a real one. A lie, assembled piece by piece, meant to be photographed from several thousand feet up by an aircraft that has not yet arrived, and might never come at all. Somewhere in occupied Europe, a German intelligence officer is waiting for confirmation that this factory, the one building Britain's fastest and most feared wooden bomber, has just been blown apart by one of his own agents. That agent is a British burglar named Eddie Chapman, a man who spent the 1930s cracking safes with gelignite and the war years cracking something rather more valuable: the trust of German military intelligence, the Abwehr. Real explosives sit nearby in a shed, supplied by his handlers for exactly this purpose. He is not going to use them. Instead, over the following hours, a small team of British intelligence officers and camouflage specialists will attempt something almost comic in its cheek: convincing Nazi Germany that a fully operational aircraft factory has been destroyed, using nothing but timber, glue, paint, and a great deal of nerve. Get it wrong, and a career criminal loses his life, and Britain loses one of its most valuable double agents. Get it right, and nobody in Berlin will ever know that a war was fought here at all, in a builder's yard, with the tools of a stage designer, rather than a soldier. It worked, and for that single night of theatre, Adolf Hitler's own war machine would go on to award a British criminal one of its highest military honours, for the destruction of a factory that never stopped working, not even for one day. By the winter of 1942, the de Havilland Mosquito had become one of the more inconvenient aircraft in the Luftwaffe's war. Built almost entirely from plywood and balsa, light enough to outrun most German fighters and fast enough to bomb targets deep inside the Reich and be home before anyone had properly worked out where it came from, the Mosquito was assembled at a sprawling factory complex in Hatfield, north of London, turning out roughly 80 aircraft a month by early 1943, nearly 3 a day. German military planners wanted the factory gone. The trouble was working out how. A conventional bombing raid carried real costs. By 1942, Luftwaffe raids over England were growing steadily more expensive in aircraft and in trained crews, against a home defense system that had only sharpened since the Blitz. A single, well-placed agent, by contrast, was cheap, deniable, and, if he could get close enough, devastating. This is precisely the logic that led German intelligence to recruit Eddie Chapman out of a prison cell in German-occupied Jersey, train him for the better part of a year in occupied France, and drop him by parachute into Cambridgeshire in December 1942, carrying cash, a wireless set, a cyanide pill, and orders to destroy the power plant that kept Mosquito production running at Hatfield. There was, however, a complication the Germans had not accounted for. Chapman turned himself into the nearest policeman within hours of landing and offered his services to British intelligence instead. This left MI5 with a problem that had no clean solution. They could not allow their new double agent to actually destroy a factory building nearly 100 bombers a month, but nor could they simply tell the Abwehr the mission had failed. Chapman's controllers were already wary of him, a proven liar with a criminal record, and any hint of failure risked exposing the whole deception. along with every other double agent Britain had running against Germany. The factory had to survive completely intact. The Germans had to believe absolutely that it had not. Responsibility for keeping Chapman credible fell to M15's Section B1A, and specifically to his case officer, a former BBC radio engineer named Ronnie Reed, who understood, better than most, how much of deception is really about controlling what a distant observer is allowed to see. Reed's dilemma was straightforward to state and almost impossible to solve. An Abwehr controller expecting proof, and a factory that needed to keep building bombers the following morning. The answer worked out with camouflage specialists from the Army's engineering unit. Some accounts also credit input from Jasper Maskelyne, the stage illusionist turned camouflage officer whose magic gang had already been experimenting with dummy tanks and vanishing harbors in North Africa, was to build the illusion not for a person standing on the ground, but for a camera looking almost straight down. On the night of 29th and 30th January, working under cover of darkness, the team constructed a set of fake bomb-damaged transformers out of timber frames and layer upon layer of papier-mâché, roughly the size and shape of the real substation units they were meant to replace, then charred and punctured to look as though something enormous had torn straight through them. Sheets of tarpaulin and corrugated iron were dragged across sections of roofing and painted with soot and shadow to suggest collapsed and blown-out sections, the kind of trick a theatre scene painter uses to suggest depth and ruin from a fixed viewing angle. Except here, the fixed viewing angle was a reconnaissance aircraft several thousand feet above. Rubble and broken masonry were scattered around the power plant to mimic blast debris, and smoke devices added a lingering, drifting haze, the sort of detail that reads as entirely convincing in a grainy monochrome photograph, even though it would collapse instantly under a torch beam at close range. Reed inspected the results personally and judged them a success, noting in his own report that aerial photography from any height above roughly 600 meters would show what looked like considerable devastation without giving the game away. To reinforce the story on the ground as well as in the air, MI5 arranged for a brief, deliberately vague item to appear in the Daily Express, reporting an explosion at a factory on the outskirts of London, vague enough to avoid awkward questions, specific enough that it convinced even de Havilland's own workforce, who had not been let in on the secret. The RAF then flew its own reconnaissance pass over the site, exactly as a German aircraft might, and its photographic interpreters flagged part of the scene as under construction, proof, as far as MI5 was concerned, that the illusion would survive scrutiny from altitude, whatever it looked like up close. Within hours, Chapman radioed his controller, Stefan von Groening, reporting that the sabotage had gone exactly to plan. There was no independent way for the Abwehr to check his story beyond his own word, and whatever aerial photography German reconnaissance might eventually manage over southern England, and for a nervous few weeks, that gap was where the entire operation lived or died. Chapman travelled back to the continent via neutral Lisbon shortly afterwards and was interrogated at length and with evident suspicion by Abwehr officers whose entire job was catching double agents out. Exactly what was said in those interrogation rooms is not fully recorded. The German paperwork did not survive the war in the way MI5's careful files did. What is documented is the outcome. Chapman held his nerve, his story held together under questioning, and his controllers concluded that their man had struck a genuine blow against British aircraft production, a small but very real psychological victory for German intelligence. At the exact moment, nothing had actually happened at all. If a Nazi spy master can be fooled by papier-mâché and a confident radio voice, it is probably worth a quick subscribe before we get to how Britain's version of this trick stacked up against everyone else's. Germany ran its own decoy programs throughout the war: dummy airfields, fake aircraft, false targets built to mislead Allied bombers into wasting their loads on empty fields. What Germany never managed, though, was the other half of the Hatfield trick: a human being, trusted by its own intelligence service, radioing back confirmation that the deception had worked. That gap existed because Britain's double-cross system, overseen by the XX Committee, had by this point captured or turned effectively every German agent operating on British soil. The Abwehr believed it had eyes inside Britain. In reality, it was working entirely from pictures Britain chose to let it see. Britain's own decoy program, meanwhile, was already running on an industrial scale elsewhere in the country. Colonel John Turner's starfish sites, decoy fires, and lighting rigs built to draw German night bombers away from real cities and factories eventually numbered more than 200 across Britain, drawing an estimated 968 tons of bombs that would otherwise have fallen on real targets. Hatfield used much the same materials and much the same cheek, but on a far smaller, far more personal scale. One factory, one photograph, one man's word on a wireless set. The nearest American equivalent came more than a year later, in 1944, when the United States Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known today as the Ghost Army. 1,100 artists, sound engineers, and radio operators used inflatable tanks, recorded engine noise, and fabricated radio traffic to convince German commanders that entire divisions existed where there were none, across more than 20 separate operations in France, Belgium, and Germany. By several American accounts, the unit was directly inspired by earlier British camouflage work. Hatfield was smaller than any of it and considerably quieter, but it came first, and it helped convince British intelligence that this kind of theatre could be trusted at the very highest level, a confidence that, by 1944, would help underpin the much larger deception built around the Normandy landings. The material outcome at Hatfield is not in dispute. The factory was never touched. Every mosquito that rolled off the line there in the months after January 1943 did so because a piece of stagecraft, not a squad of guards, had persuaded German intelligence the job was already finished. What is harder to measure is everything the deception prevented: how many further sabotage attempts against Hatfield, or factories like it, were quietly abandoned because German intelligence believed the work was already done. That figure does not exist in any file, and probably never will. The reward, at least, is well documented. In the spring of 1943, in German-occupied Norway, Chapman was presented with the Iron Cross, becoming, so far as the historical record shows, the only British citizen ever to receive Nazi Germany's highest decoration for services rendered to the Reich. He returned to Britain with a genuine medal, pinned on him for a piece of sabotage that had never happened. More lastingly, Hatfield reinforced the credibility of the entire double-cross system at a moment when it badly needed reinforcing. The confidence British intelligence gained here, that elaborate theatrical deception aimed at a single suspicious officer, could actually hold up, carried through to the far larger deceptions that misled German high command about the true location of the Normandy landings the following year. Chapman's Iron Cross, along with reconnaissance photographs of the faked wreckage and Reed's original report, is today held among the declassified files at the National Archives in Kew and has featured in exhibitions at the Imperial War Museum. Chapman himself remained to the end of his life a complicated figure, genuinely useful to his country, and just as genuinely unrepentant about the criminal life he never fully left behind. Return to Hatfield, Gone Midnight, January the 29th, 1943. Strip away everything that happened afterwards, the Iron Cross, the ceremony in Norway, the decades of classified files, and what is left is a handful of men in the dark, gluing paper to timber, painting shadows onto tin roofing, scattering rubble by torchlight. No explosive charge was set that night. No building came down. No aircraft were lost. No workers hurt. No production halted. Not even for a single shift. The only thing actually destroyed at Hatfield in January 1943 was an idea, sitting in the mind of a German intelligence officer several hundred miles away. The idea that his own agent could be trusted, and that his own eyes, looking down from an aircraft at grainy photographs of rubble, could be trusted too. A career burglar who once made his living blowing open bank vaults with gelignite ended the war having built his most successful piece of work not from steel or explosive, but from paper, paint, and nerve, and walked away with the enemy's highest military honor for a crime that was never actually committed. No factory burned, no bombs fell, no blood was spilled. And yet, for a few crucial months, Nazi Germany believed all three had happened, entirely on the strength of some papier-mâché and a very good liar's voice on the radio. That, in the end, is the story worth remembering here. That in a war decided as much by radar, code-breaking, and industrial output as by soldiers, one of Britain's quieter victories was won with glue and cardboard in the dark by men whose names barely appear in the history books. And somewhere in Germany, a medal was struck, engraved, and pinned to a British criminal's chest in honor of a factory that the following morning simply went on building bombers.